We have a very interesting panel moderated by Nick Garber. The bios are in materials. So, Nick, turn it over to you and let us begin.
All right. Thanks very much. Is my mic on? Can anyone hear me? Okay. A little louder. Well, thanks everyone for being here. So we're here to talk about the 485X program, formerly known as Affordable Neighborhoods for New Yorkers. I don't think anyone really calls it that, do they? The major tax break for incentivizing multifamily housing construction in New York City as of a couple of years ago. I thought we could start with kind of a brief history, maybe starting with you, Ross, and maybe each person should briefly introduce themselves when they start speaking. Ross, could you just describe on the most basic level why does New York City need tax breaks like this to have significant housing construction? What's the history of that?
Thanks, Nick. Ross Moskowitz. I'm a partner at Hogan Lovells. I'm also a class of '84 in New York law. Thanks to Ross Sandler, Ben Max for arranging for this. It's my first time at one of these. I have my colleagues here, and now I understand why they come back from this event very pumped about tax cert and the like. So it's great to see some other familiar faces. Nick says, why do we need this? There are a lot of people, maybe not in this room, but a lot of people who don't think we need this. But let's do a little history here. There's sort of 5 points of inflection of the tax exemptions in New York City with what they call it 421A, which started in the 70s. Legislature was trying to actually get development going, particularly in Manhattan, where there's abandonment. So the origin of this tax exemption actually was to encourage development. I want to remind everyone of that, to encourage development. So over the years, we go into the 80s, the second point of inflection, where there starts to be more activity outside of the core of Manhattan. And there also starts to become a bit of a political conversation about whether these exemptions are really worth the value that they're getting, right? And you can argue whether getting 80 cents on the dollar versus maybe not getting the dollar at all is worth doing. But there starts to question in the 80s whether that's worth doing. And there starts to be a valuation also of the affordability. But it continues. There starts to be a little bit more chipping away at the legislation and at the exemption. So then you hit another point of inflection in the 2000s, early 2000s, where geographic exclusion areas start coming up. And you start to get areas that would not be eligible for these tax breaks, these tax exemptions, unless affordable housing was built. The affordable housing didn't have to be built on site necessarily, and the concept of 421 negotiable certificates became a cottage industry, as some of you will recall. And projects that were being built in Brooklyn, 1,000 units of affordable housing could then be sold as negotiable certificates to qualify a project on the Upper East Side, on the Upper West Side, or anywhere else in Manhattan, so that off-site certificates, off-site housing was being built. And then it got chipped away even more. And you started to reduce the number of negotiable certificates. So then you get to 2017, another point of inflection, where the Affordable New York program became part of the legislation. And that also chipped away and made more of a requirement, actually mandatory requirement of affordable housing on site. And we put negotiable certificates over here. So you had this evolution beginning in the 70s where trying to have development, then chipped away a little bit more at, well, maybe we should have affordable housing, and now maybe we should have affordable housing on site. So now we sit here in 2022, which is the most recent legislation, the Affordables for New York legislation, and that's really the debate. And I have two colleagues here who are experts in this world, much smarter than I am on what actually the practical is. But the debate is still whether you can do any kind of housing and qualify under the new 485X, and that has more restrictions attached to it. Again, you think about the process, and since we've all been in government, Tricia's still in government, that's why she's still smiling. The idea that, the idea that government starts to, some people call loopholes, and there are loopholes in the 485X too that we're going to talk about, where government starts to close that out. And the question is that good policy? You know, what is the policy? What is the objective here? Today, you will hear, if you haven't, that there's a $12.6 billion deficit in New York City, $2 billion in this year and $10.6 billion in 27. So let's see, 12.6 billion. I've got a lot of smart people in this audience. Where do you think a lot of that tax money is going to come from? Real estate taxes. 43% of the budget, as you all know, is made up of real estate taxes and other real estate related taxes. So how reconcile this? And how are we also going to drive the need for affordable housing, which universally is accepted as an issue? So I'm gonna leave it there, Nick.
Thanks a lot. Anything either of you would want to add to that historical perspective before we jump ahead in time a little bit?
Sure. So Basha Gerhards, Executive Vice President of Public Policy for the Real Estate Board of New York. I would add, when we think about these inflection points, there's also where the tax tool is intersecting with other public policy tools. So when we talk about Affordable New York and really the last reiteration of 421A that expired in 2022, we are thinking about it in the context of the city adopting, first in the country, really mandatory inclusionary housing and how those two tools needed to work together. Fast forward to 485X, we really need to think about that in the context of lifting the 12 FAR cap, City of Yes for housing opportunity, and the other kind of zoning changes that the city has been pursuing over the last several years.
Yeah, I guess I will also introduce myself and add a couple words. My name is Tricia Dietz. I'm the Assistant Commissioner of Housing Incentives at HPD, so administering the tax incentive programs. So the previous 421A 1 through 15 projects, but there are still some of the 421A 16 projects, the 485X projects, 467M. And I'm sure I'm missing
J51.
Oh, J51, sure, J51. The inclusionary housing projects, so voluntary mandatory tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, and 420C and Article 11. Sorry.
Oh, and now the universal affordability.
Universal affordability preference.
Tricia's busy.
Sorry. I was just going to add, I think that a really important context is that there are, anytime that there is some type of tax policy, it's a question about what is the values of the city and kind of what is the cost benefit value that the city is putting on certain practices. And I think that it's a really good timeline, and just, in starting in the 70s and 80s, what the focus was on development and just purely development of residential housing. And then how has that changed? And what were the lessons that were learned from that? And the kind of controls and changes that were made kind of due to those kind of action, kind of policy and the market that has moved beyond it.
Thanks. So to just jump ahead to the last couple of years, maybe if any of you could give a brief history of how 485X specifically came to be. So I think if my dates are not wrong, 421A expired in 2022. There was a 1-year lapse where no deal was reached in Albany. Everyone came back in 24, and with advocacy of the Adams administration, with the real estate industry, with organized labor, this new program was drawn up. I don't know, Basha, would you want to maybe give kind of a brief overview of how this program came to be?
So it's odd to sit here today and say I was dealing with supply skeptics. I was talking with legislators who did not believe 421A was necessary for housing production, but that was the case in 2022 when the program expired. They did not believe that housing production would effectively fall off a cliff. And there was a lot of conversation around, well, we don't need to give tools to the private sector. They will build anyway because it's New York. That's not what happened in 2022 when the deadline extension was not realized, and everyone knew they had to finish by 2026. I think it was easy to forget in that moment that a number of projects have been put on pause during COVID, to forget about the macroeconomic factors about why someone may not have been able to get financing in time, and to put aside, when you're sitting in Albany, how long the permitting process is in the city of New York. So we were sitting there in 2022 trying to articulate how many units were at stake here. And that really relied on the industry stepping up and sharing information, which is always tricky. It's very proprietary. People don't necessarily want to share with their competitors what they're up to or what they're doing. So we said, we'll keep everything anonymous, but please, please, please tell us if you're impacted and you need more time. And that survey, from that survey, we learned there were 66,000 units at risk. And when looking at historic data from the Department of City Planning, we realized that was nearly 2/3, if not 75% or more, of the city's expected pipeline. So we went back to Albany in 2023 and said, you really need to do something about this. At the time, there was a lot of discussion about, well, what else are we going to get from you? What else can we get from this public policy tool? What's the value add, as Tricia referenced, from extending the deadline and giving people more time to complete under 421A? A lot of the conversation comes back to, when we're talking about affordability, who is that affordable for? And when you had so many developers utilizing the 30 at 130% AMI option in neighborhoods where 130 AMI was higher than market rate rents, it made it a very challenging conversation to talk about extending the deadline for those types of projects. So when you look at the deadline extension language that was ultimately approved as part of the housing package in 2024, we were successful in saying, don't change AMI bands within the different options. If that is the option you find most egregious, drop it. Don't make changes to labor requirements in the deadline extension. We need to have that conversation as part of a new tax tool. You need to recognize people have already done due diligence from a financial perspective, from a design perspective. Don't muck up those projects. Let them, they're shovel ready, let them move forward, and just give them more time given all of these macro factors I already covered. Luckily, we were successful there, and that was part of the deal in 2024. That did mean, though, they were looking for lower affordability in a new tax program, the replacement for 421A. It did mean the legislators were really clear about ensuring higher labor standards, both on the building service side and on the construction side, and we had to grapple with that in the design of 485.
Tricia, anything you'd want to add about how the city was involved in shaping the program?
I won't add as much about our involvement in that, but I will say it just now it is interesting. I think of one of the requirements that came out of that extension for 421A was a requirement that developments file what was called a notice of intent to use that extension. It did identify 70,000 units approximately, and it is interesting. We took a look, and 1/3 of those have completed, so completed within the timeline, but there are still 2/3 of those units that have not yet completed. And so it speaks to kind of the need and the importance of what that extension was, especially at that time.
Thanks. I want to add to, having supported the REBNY and Basha on some of this, on the legislation, some of the historical data also showed the number of buildings that had been built since the changes in 85 with 421A versus without 421A. Maybe a handful of all the buildings built, in a 25-year period without 421A. So it showed again how important that program was, which I think also helped sway the legislature.
Basha, would you mind giving like a brief sketch of exactly of the most important ways 485X differs from 421A?
And Tricia will interject if I missed anything. So a couple of different things. First, it got rid of the A through F, G options and collapsed them based on building size. And this was a really actually important part of the conversation when we talk about transparency and what someone sees when they see a building going in. A lot of times people, if you're walking down the street, you see it's a 10-story building. They didn't know what option it was coming under or what affordability they could expect from that project. And that was something we thought was worth being responsive to. So the program instead distinguishes between different building sizes. Building sizes then dictate how much affordability share of the project needs to be income restricted. The other big difference is now, not in addition to the AMI levels overall being lower than what was in 421A 17 or 16, I should say, is that the affordability requirements are permanent. And that is a very significant shift when you think about the tax terms and the benefit, and what does it mean for the market rate units to cross-subsidize those income restricted units in perpetuity. I think one of the other really big differences when we start looking at the affordability shares was there was a recognition that smaller buildings have a harder time carrying those costs over time. And so the affordability share was set at 20% with a higher AMI band. The larger projects were deemed to be appropriate to cover that affordability weight. And so that's a 25% share at a lower AMI than the other buildings. No more 30 at 130. We now have 25% at 60% AMI. Another big shift is in terms of how construction wage standards are looked at. It went from, one could say, somewhat complicated math of average site-wide wage within the now wage zones to a percentage off the prevailing wage within two wage zones. Wage zone A, which is effectively Manhattan south of 96th Street, and then portions of the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront. So this includes Long Island City, Greenpoint, Dumbo, and then Zone B is effectively other geographies adjacent to those within Brooklyn and Queens. For both of these geographies, when we're talking about a discount off the prevailing wage, in some cases, this is a 20% increase off of the average site-wide wage requirements that existed under 421A 16.
There's also minimum wage requirements, but for projects above 100 units.
Yeah, we've heard about that one, right?
I guess some other differences in the program. There is now one of the challenges in creating a new version of the program was identifying what the universe of affected projects was. And so one of the big changes is a new requirement to register your intent to use the program, and some additional notice requirements based on size of the project. I think this is something that has taken some time to adjust and get used to, but there are a couple different requirements. So there's a requirement for projects over 100 units to provide notice to the comptroller and HPD 6 months prior to starting construction, and then within 6 months of starting construction, filing a notice of registration with HPD. We've tried to make those very simple, but that is one of the aspects that's new, that also allows us to kind of talk through who is going to be using the program in a way that is helpful to kind of describe the intent of the program moving forward. Another change is MWBE requirements that are associated with all projects of all sizes. Let's see what else.
And I think, what Tricia's talking about is consistent throughout all of the policies. If you look at, again, cities, whether small business services or economic development corporation, any other agency, emphasis on MWB and goals along those lines are consistent. I want to go back to something Basha said, though, permanency. That truly is a game changer in this type of program. So that was very much part of sort of the horse trading. But I also want you to think about sort of the development community can be adaptable. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but they actually are adaptable. So when mandatory inclusionary housing came in, for instance, the development community first put up their hands and said, well, that's ridiculous. We can't afford that. But as we have seen, affordable housing has become now the nomenclature, right? That is something that is part of every project, and no one really blinks anymore. What will be interesting, and which we'll maybe get into in a second, is the whole issue about the 100 units, below 100 units, and not being required to do certain type of union wages. And the 99 quote, which is, if you don't know what that means, then you really should, because 99 is much discussed in possible journal these days. The idea that if you stay under 100 units, you have a whole different program and you don't have to do the union wages. And that's yet to be adaptable, and we could debate that right now, whether it should or shouldn't be. But again, the development community ultimately gets on board. This is one that still seems to be a struggle, and it's a heavy debate as to whether the development community is actually looking at the analysis correctly. And I know Basha and Tricia actually could have two different points on this.
Well, yeah, I guess we should go into sort of the heart of it, which is how it's working. I guess just to summarize what I've seen, and you guys can complicate this, but REBNY has been somewhat critical of, was critical at the very start about the new wage rules in particular, and has been quick to point out this proliferation of 99-unit buildings all around the city that seem to be designed to not trigger that wage floor. The city administration, at least under the previous administration, I don't know how things are working at this moment, has been a little more bullish, if that's fair to say, about at least the early indicators, and saying that it's sort of too soon to say whether this is going to be a really functional program or not. Yeah, I guess maybe Tricia, if you want to start, what is HPD's kind of broad take about the signs so far? Any data you might have on hand about how it's going?
Yeah, sure. So we have been publishing data about the registrations. So we did provide the first set, I believe, in May, and the second set in November. So there are indications of the use of the program. So I will try to find and read it from my notes. But I think the other aspect of this that I think is significant is just what the program is who the program is meant to serve. So it is interesting in the 421A program, the median unit size of projects was 18 units. So while we think of 421A as predominantly serving large buildings, the truth is it was a very large driver of development across the city, predominantly in smaller buildings. And so far, the registration data for 485X, the median unit size is 19 units. So consistent with, one unit is give or take about the same, like a couple big projects, right? But it is consistent with what the universe of projects being served under 421A was. I will also say one of the aspects of the extension of 421A 16 was that there's a number of developments that are still in construction. A number of folks still have buildings that are currently being developed and worked on that are using 421A 16. And that is the intent of those buildings, and they will have until 2031. Somebody can fact check me, but they will have until 2031 in order to complete those buildings. So there is still time under that program. The projects that are going to be using 485X are needing to identify new sites to do so. They are, accumulating lots. They're identifying what those development sites are, and that takes time. We do know that there are projects that are, within that 6 months prior to starting construction, and we know that there are projects that are before that 6 months prior to construction that are out there that are putting together plans for projects that will eventually use 485X that are over 100 units. But at this time in the data and the registration data, there are no projects that are above that size.
So if I can ask a little more about what the city has seen so far, aside from that average of 19-ish units, it's okay if you don't have the number on hand, but any trends you've gathered from the geography of where the filings have been, any positive or negative indicators so far?
We are seeing developments kind of in very similar areas as we had been seeing 421A previously. So I don't know that there's anything specifically about the geography. There are a number of buildings, and I feel like I should be able to find the number on my notes, but I apologize for that. Okay, sorry. 188 buildings, 5,700 total units, 1,170 affordable units in that registration data so far as of October 31st. And it is available on open data. So I really would welcome folks to look at it. I think the other thing that has happened in the last couple of years that's very interesting in the way that kind of our city is working with other policies is the City of Yes changes. And one of the aspects of that was that there is now inclusionary housing framework across the city that is allowing projects that are 45X, that plan to use 45X, to also use the universal affordability preference and make their buildings a little bit bigger. And the combination of those programs has also meant that some of the buildings that are currently being designed have taken a little bit of additional time to kind of work through what those zoning requirements are, work on what the type of flexibility that is now provided under that text has been. And so we're seeing a few delays that I think are probably associated with that, but it's also, I think that it's one of those things where sometimes programs and policy take time, and it's oftentimes we want, fast solutions and to be able to say something is working immediately. And sometimes it's just not always possible. So I would say, I think that we're still waiting to see what the impact is. I think that there are promising signs. There's promising signs that it is consistent with the impact and the goal of the impact of what 421-16 is, but it has now lowered the affordability level so that the affordability that's being achieved is deeper.
Yeah, I would add, that's a really good point Tricia's saying. I think 485X was still being sorted out, and then City of Yes shows up. And I think our clients have been sort of reevaluating then their projects based on that. So the push, so to speak, to go for the 485X or not to is getting reevaluated in light of a City of Yes. So I think that's typically how city policy is supposed to work. City policy creates the framework, and then the market, which is really what this is about, the market then dictates what gets done.
So I want to add a little nuance. We didn't say 485X wasn't going to work at all. What we said was pretty consistently that we didn't think it was going to work for larger projects. And I want to spend a moment talking about why larger projects are so important. We have Mark sitting here. Furman did a great analysis on the 421A program over 10 years. 2/3 of the new income restricted units built through 421A were in buildings with 100 units or more. And that means 1/10 were in buildings smaller than 50 units. When we look back at historic production levels for New York City, city planning did their analysis of, larger projects. Again, this idea of 100 units or more generating, 48% of the units, but only representing 10% of the projects. So when you have zero over 100 unit projects over two culls of data, so to speak, with the registration data, that sends up a warning sign. I don't want to be right about this at all. We need more housing. We need 500,000 units by 2034. We're not going to achieve that at scale if we don't get the larger projects. So City of Yes spent a lot of time thinking about what I refer to both in terms of the missing middle of AMI production, but also typology, the Main Street zoning, the TOD language, transit-oriented development language, the pieces around infill. That's really targeted to, I want to say 10 to 50 unit buildings. And so I would expect that to work really well with 485X, where the options for that size of building, again, was 20% affordability share at 80% AMI. We need 20 of those to make up for the 2,000 unit project that is not moving forward in the Brooklyn waterfront right now. And I think that's really where we want to focus in on is how do we get those larger projects? Is it the 3 that I'm aware of that are moving forward? 2 of the sites, the property owner had them for a while, had them pre-485X. UAP was mapped on those sites, and now all of a sudden the density is what is making that viable from a unit production mix, and they're going to sign PLAs. So if we know that it's a pretty narrow sieve you have to fit through in order to get those larger projects, and we know we need those larger projects because that's what achieves our housing goals at scale, then I'm going to sit here every panel and say we need to figure out a change to 485X or we need something else. Fundamentally, when we look at 485X, I don't think we're touching the AMI levels. I wouldn't recommend we touch the AMI levels. I think that's the type of units we need. There's a lot of data supporting the need for those lower AMI units. The construction wages, should we be spending $300,000 on someone when we need to build housing for $30,000 households? Maybe not, but that's a value judgment that the legislators have to make. If we're not addressing the cost of the program, I don't want to see public subsidy going to this. So what are the other tools that are available to the city, to the state to make that math work? Until we make that math work, we're not going to see these larger projects.
Basha, if you had to pinpoint the biggest area of concern with 485X as it currently is, I know there's probably the most attention has surrounded the sort of 99 versus 100 unit threshold, but I think REBNY has arguably been even more concerned about is it a $72 an hour wage in Manhattan and the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront? Is it fair to say that might even be a bigger?
Yeah, the 74.26 or 65% off the prevailing wage in Zone A and $64.58 or 60% off the prevailing wage, I think is a lot more concern. The former controller on his way out the door issued the draft rules on the construction wage requirements. So this is both for the elevated minimum for all projects over 100 units. The lack of those rules, I think, was definitely had a cooling effect in terms of what did enforcement look like, and that once you inject financial risk and liability, people are going to wait. And some people don't want to wait because they need to move forward for a host of other reasons. And, I think it's unfortunate to see larger sites seeing multiple 99 unit buildings. Someone could call that a loophole. Someone could say that's creative site planning. But to me, it's a waste of floor area. We've spent all this time, over 10 years, to get the 12 FAR cap lifted. These neighborhood rezonings take 3 years or more to move through the public review process. And you have people basically leaving units on the table when we have an affordability crisis because of these different provisions and the financial risk they created.
Ross, if you could speak at all to sort of what you're hearing from clients, any between the perspectives we've heard just now, does either one resonate?
Yeah, I mean, they all resonate. And one of the things you have to remember for our clients is when did they take over the property, right? That's, as you all know in this audience, what's their basis? And there are clients of ours who are looking at 485X and figuring out, well, we could still do this even with the wages and the characteristics that Basha just outlined because they've been holding the property for a long time. I would suggest that's an easier scenario, and they will find solutions. And their profit margin is going to be different because, again, of their basis. And they have the ability, therefore, to finance more favorably. Other clients of ours are not touching us. We have clients who are looking at a project that could be 400 units, and they're going to build 399 units, right? Tax lot, tax lot, tax lot. It's very simple. Until Trish and the city figure out a way to stop that. And I don't think they're going to look to stop that, but that's not policy, right? That's not really what we should be encouraging, going back to what Basha said. So there does need to be a solution. I think labor in particular is very conscious of this. And I do think when you sit there and some of our clients are entering into PLAs, we have a large Brooklyn project right now, which, is about 5,000 units at some point. It's a 10 building project. We're going to do a 485X there because we're going to enter into an agreement that's going to make it financially doable. We also have a good basis on it, and we have it at a good price. So those are factors that all go into this. So one size does not fit all, which is unfortunate then, because predictability and certainty for real estate is what it's all about. So if you don't fit into the pattern that allows you to take advantage of this, you're going to go an alternate way. And that's the practicality of where we sit today.
Could you say more? You said you think labor has some understanding of the economics. I mean, publicly, I think the building trades have been pretty, gung-ho about this program being well designed and that the concerns are overblown. I mean, have you heard any different?
Well, let's look at the current situation and who endorsed who for the mayoral race. The construction trades were not supporting the current mayor, right? So, but they're also realistic. And if you look at today's announcement, the mayor, and I think it's a great idea. The question is practicality again. And Trish, I don't want to put you on the spot, but city financed projects. He wants to get to 200,000 new homes that are city sponsored projects. And up until now, historically, at least, even under as most recently as the de Blasio administration and Adams administration, they did not use union labor. And the mayor announced today that he's going to use union labor. So I'd like to see the math on that.
Tricia, could you say more about, you touched on City of Yes a minute ago and UAP, which for anyone who doesn't know, it's, a component of City of Yes that allows for denser development and projects that include affordable housing. Could you just speak more to how the city is thinking about how City of Yes will intersect with this program and maybe also the ballot questions that were approved in the fall, if you have any insight there?
Sure. So the City of Yes, the Universal Affordability Preference, UAP program, it was designed specifically with the understanding that there was a tax exemption program that has been available for many years. And so the concept and the design of the program was that wherever there is a building with affordable housing, that building with affordable housing can have a larger FAR cap than the building without affordable housing. And the difference between what a building is without affordable housing versus the building with is what has to be affordable housing. So in other words, there was a voluntary inclusionary housing program before that got replaced with this. And in that program, for every square foot of affordable housing produced, you received 1.25. Depending on district, but so for simplification purposes, you received 1.25 square feet of of floor area. So under this new version, it's really 1 for 1. And the concept is that really you can build a bigger building. You are going to provide affordable housing through a tax exemption, and that will allow you to build a bigger building that has both the affordability and the tax exemption. And by providing both of those together, you can have the larger building and also the deeper affordability that the zoning requires versus what the tax exemption requires. So the zoning text has an average of 60% AMI versus the average of 80 under the 45X tax exemption. There is also, so that is the version of this program that exists in the medium and higher density districts. There is also a version of this called qualified residential sites that exists in the lower density districts. And I'll just put a small plug out because I haven't really done this yet. But we did provide application materials on our website yesterday for folks that are interested in what we are calling ACRES, affordable qualifying residential sites.
We love our acronym.
It sounds nice, so I like it. ACRES. That's
good to know. Can you speak at all to the ballot questions and how those might intersect?
I don't think I'm prepared to talk about them. I know that city planning is working on it together with HPD and the Board of Standards and Appeals.
City planning was kind enough to do a briefing for several of our members, 50 of our members actually last week. So I'll jump in if that's all right on a couple of things. City planning told us to tell everyone their doors are open for people who believe they will fall under both ELRP, the expedited land use review procedure. And then the affordable housing fast track. So this is both the BSA piece and then also those who will be in the yet to be finalized community districts that fall under I would say the bottom fifth of production over the last 10 years. Part of what city planning has to do in order to implement the charter proposals is local rulemaking. This includes the methodology and the posting of those bottom production community boards, the setting up of the zoning appeals board, which technically someone could go to today. They just don't have their formal process set up. And similarly, the thing I was most excited about, for those who don't know, I worked at the Borough President's Office for a number of years and oversaw the Topographic Bureau. This is digitizing of the city map. That is a multi-stage process because those maps physically live in the 5 Borough President's offices across the 5 boroughs. To digitize and centralize that won't happen until 2026 2029. That's a multi-stage process, but that also requires rulemaking. So, we were told to stay tuned and that city planning's doors are open for people who are looking to start moving affordable housing projects sooner. I think the other thing that's important to note, and again, this kind of intersects with the work under City of Yes, the universal affordability preference, we've been talking about the affordability shares under 485X. They define affordable housing projects as essentially MIH equivalent. So that's 25% to 30% affordability shares. So I think that's a really important piece here. It's not about a purity test. You're 100% affordable. It's, are you delivering any affordable units at a significant share? And that's defined as 25% or greater, whether you can avail yourself of these new tools. I think the other thing we're going to be tracking pretty closely is the SECRA, the State Environmental Quality Review Act changes that the governor has proposed in the executive budget, and how that aligns with the Green Fast Track work city planning already completed, and the rulemaking for the charter proposals. And again, I would say all of this seems really geared towards encouraging housing production across the city, in going after really those mid-sized projects. If I was a developer, I'd be looking at, okay, where can I build the most 50 to, unfortunately, 99 units? The zoning's aligned for that. 485X is aligned to that. Green Fast Track is aligned to that. The SECRA changes that are proposed are aligned to that. That seems to be the sweet spot. Again, I would love to be wrong. Please go produce 500 of those to offset the larger projects we're not seeing.
Since we're on the topic of the charter questions, the ballot measures, it's okay if it doesn't have to do with 485X in particular, Ross. Any thoughts how big a deal they are?
They're huge. They're after City of Yes, they're the most significant changes in the last 60 years. And this mayor actually voted for all the pro-housing ones. So you're gonna, it's an interesting point of inflection though within the administration. Again, you go back to government setting the table, creating the platform, lowercase p, to allow for the market to develop. But you have competing factors going on, including, we talked before about the budget, and we talked about affordable housing. And, how do you reconcile that? I think this mayor has a lot of momentum to actually execute, but like we saw in Williamsburg when the original rezoning was done, which set the table, but then city planning went back to the table because they did not get what they were looking for. Similarly, along Queens Boulevard, there was a big rezoning done. And then 10 years later, they looked at how many really new units were built and they had to rezone it again. So I'm going back to what Tricia said about 15, 20 minutes ago. It's really still to see how this is going to play out. And you really have to, again, see how the policies shake, how the politics, this is political, no, right? Let's not be naive about it. There's an election year for the governor this year, who is clearly looking to help, and gave the mayor a big win coming out of the box on universal care. But there's a lot more that has to be digested. And it's only going to take 1 or 2 projects to start to show if the 485X can work to Basha's point, for the larger projects. But until then, I think we're just going to see a lot of these 99 going forward. But it's still, I'm not going to suggest it's not a pro-development or pro-housing administration or atmosphere. To the contrary, I think all the stars are aligned for more development. It's just a matter of the economics of it, and you still have to continue to do the math.
Since you mentioned that, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add, it's also important to note that all of this is in a specific economic climate. And I think that has also been, we are in a different place today than we were, 5 years ago. Coming out of a pandemic and 5 years before that. And so I think that there's been a lot of policy trying to understand where the market is, but the market also changes quite a bit faster than policy can change. And that is the product of the way that policy works and the way that these tax exemptions work. And I think starting back from just the understanding that this is kind of based on kind of a broader economic marketplace that is impacting kind of the availability of private equity and rates. It's been very impactful.
Well, since Ross brought up the politics of it all, I have to ask, obviously, if there were to be any changes to 485X, that would have to come through Albany, probably through the budget process. requiring a whole lot of wrangling with lawmakers in the governor's office. I don't know, Basha, can you speak at all to, is REBNY going to approach anyone in Albany this year with potential changes?
For the sake of my personal sanity, we're going to that question. But, I have a job to do. So I'm going to say that in a lot of ways, we're at an odd point where we were successful with the deadline extension, and there's a lot of projects that still need to finish that. Conversions for 67M have been so successful beyond my wildest dreams for that program. That was a real labor of love in terms of thinking through from the preservation side, fair housing perspective, and from the correcting for the commercial office challenges, how do we use these obsolete office buildings, and the fact that conversions are driving 11% of the production versus 485X driving 3%. In the existing pipeline right now, I'm looking at that, and I don't necessarily see from an elected official's perspective why there's an impetus for them to listen to me right now. It's larger projects on 485X. And I am paid to think about how they think about me and the industry and all of this. Just like with 421A with the deadline extension, though, I do hope some of them do choose to listen. I'm also paid to think about what's going to happen long term. Long term, we do not have a unlimited supply of obsolete office buildings. That is a finite universe. It is a finite universe of buildings that are suitable for conversions. It is a finite universe of that pipeline, and eventually that pipeline will be finished. And what do we do then? And what worries me more than anything is, because the development process is so long, because people have to think years in advance of where the available sites are and the putting those sites together for the assemblage, and to think through, will there be rules in place? Will this tax incentive even still be in existence? And 485X is a 10-year program, so that's doing a little bit better than we have done in the past reiterations of 421A, where it was 3 or 5 years. So you do have that runway. If we haven't made improvements on our permitting process, if that continues to take multiple years, and I use the joke about a street tree and a tree pit needing 6 agencies if you're in a waterfront in a historic district, like if we don't fix that fundamental piece, then we don't have a viable tax tool. And every time the neighborhood rezoning goes to the city council, they pick MIH options that don't align with 485X, then we're not going to have a future pipeline. And so that's the thing we're really just going to keep monitoring from a industry and data perspective. And we'll see. Every year I go up to Albany and say, hey, we need more housing and we need to do this at scale. Do you want to talk about math? And on 467M, it's amazing how they were willing to talk about math. But with 485X, because the emotions and the feelings were so high about affordability levels, and if someone's working on that project, they should be paid a certain wage, it made it really hard to talk about math and what it takes to operate these buildings long term, and what it takes to get the financing for these buildings long term, and how the programs really need to encourage that.
I would add, and again, it's sort of real time, the executive order that came down today from the feds on single family housing being owned by institutional investors. So that may not seem directly applicable to this group or in New York City, but it does have an impact, right? Because our clients and institutional investors, developers, whatever, they have capital, and where are they going to place their capital? And if they feel that the environment, or that in fact they're either under attack or it has an impact on their bottom line, they may have to reallocate that capital. So we don't see that, right? You don't see that unless you're in the boardroom hearing the conversation, and we're going to throw 1 million square feet into New York City, or we're going to go to West Palm, we're going to go to Dallas. Right. So that also has an impact. That environment has an impact. Again, certainty and timing is very important to the development community. So no matter what Tricia and her agency are doing to encourage it, if the atmosphere itself coming out of the federal government is one of discouragement, that will have an impact, on where capital is placed.
I guess we should say one reason to maybe be cynical that there will be any changes anytime soon is that 485X is authorized, I think, until 2034, right? It was a 10-year program. So if I'm not mistaken, the way they like to do things in Albany is they wait for something to expire and then figure it out at that point. So maybe we'll have
You also worry going back in. You worry that someone reconsiders what got done, and then it's open for a full discussion.
As I've learned the hard way, it could always be made worse.
Yeah, I was going to say there is an advantage of it being 10 years. I think we have, as a industry, there has been a cycle around the expiration of 421A that ramps up and ramps down in a way that I don't have any data to confirm, but I can just assume it creates quite a bit of inefficiency within the market. And so hopefully this longer extended timeline for 485X can at least allow projects that have longer horizons to start with more confidence.
Well, I think we can turn things over soon to questions if anyone wants to think of some questions for the panelists. One more question for now. I mean, we've been talking about this, but with the caveat that this is all hypothetical for the moment, would anyone care to mention a couple potential reforms to the program? I'm guessing maybe HPD is not in that position, but anything that REBNY or that you, Ross, are hoping broadly at some point will be under discussion for changes?
I think realistically, there sort of needs to be a coming to Jesus moment to get the scale that we're talking about with a 1.4 vacancy in New York City that everyone agrees it's across the board. It's not just affordable housing that's required, it's any housing that's required, right? You look at whether people are leaving New York City. No one's leaving New York City. If they are, they're doing it quietly. More people who need apartments, young professionals, are flooding to New York City right now. So the demand is even greater than before. So you just need housing. So I think there has to be some recognition. There seems to be almost like a distrust, I guess, to say it bluntly, about numbers. And I feel like there has to be folks at the table on both sides, let's call it labor and development, that can actually feel a little more comfortable showing numbers. And there has to be sort of that moment. And this is the time. The stars couldn't be any more aligned to develop in New York City right now, between the programs that Tricia outlined and the programs that Basha outlined, between just everything. So it's a moment that shouldn't be missed.
Turn things over to questions from the audience. Anyone?
Large apartments, we need to build as condominiums. There is a tax benefit program which permits 20-year tax abatement, no taxes at all, if it's owner-occupied. It has but no one knows how to use it because it requires that per square footage is less than $89 per square foot, and no one can tell you what's going to be in 3-4. Department of Finances, we don't know. How can we do this? We have to go to Albany and set it up. I have an idea. I think we should say $89 a square foot, but you have a 15% leeway. If you go 50% higher, you could get 80%. That's plan. Do it. If you don't, you get a portion of tax rate.
Yeah, so I think the question is about 45X option D, that is the homeownership option. There is a requirement that the average assessed value at the time of completion is $89 per square foot. It is an average, so there is, if there are units that have individual assessed values above $89, they can be charged just what that difference is. But it is a fair point and a fair criticism that it is difficult for a project, especially in certain areas of the city, to identify what their future assessed value would be. So I'm happy to take it offline. The requirement is that the average assessed value is $89 per square foot.
I was just going to pick up on the condo. All of this discussion of 485X, other than this little bit here, is all about rental property. And I just think it's important to note that there is still a condo market out there. They may be larger buildings. If they take the affordability, they can do the UAP piece as well. And that's helping to set land values. Right. So if anybody was under an illusion that 45X would lessen land prices in Manhattan, they were, for a number of reasons, quite diluted. Well, I just think it's important to understand this is all happening in a context where condos are still out there. And also the discussion about, I think, about for 45X, if you're doing something through a city program, right, and you're the issue here is if it's more expensive to do a large building, that's just an issue of city subsidy. So we might see larger buildings here, but the question that we're really discussing is non-subsidized buildings, and will there be any of those?
Right. And we are starting to see, I mean, this also gets back to the Euler pipeline, right? Like when there's a city-sponsored rezoning for a site, the city's looking to maximize the number of units it can produce on that site. And the city now has more tools, both with the lifting of the 12 FAR cap, the different components under City of Yes. But it does come down to city subsidy. That conversation's more complicated with the Construction Justice Act and with the mayor saying, I want to build with labor. We know what it takes to build with labor. With those types of wages, those units are not $500,000 to produce, most likely. There must something much higher.
And Mark, that adds directly to that challenge we were talking about before, because we're working with a project now where the city's looking for us to do something. And we said, that's going to cost more money. And they've said, yeah, we know we're going to need to subsidize more. So where's that cost benefit analysis has to go into that, right? Correct.
And we do need home ownership. And, you know, this gets into it. We could probably spend another hour on why home ownership programs aren't working or are working. But I would say the fundamental debate is between should home ownership programs be used to generate generational wealth and equity, or should those home ownership units be permanently affordable? And those are two different very program designs. Those are two very different public policy goals. And quite frankly, there is a geographic divide in how elected officials view the answer to that question.
Can I ask you?
I'll ask one.
Yeah.
I'll add one additional point to this. There was actually another change that happened in 45X that was to remove the 35 unit cap to option D. So this was to allow for larger projects, but again, there is larger products with more units in it within certain geographies that would qualify. So just adding.
While we wait for our next question, I not to force a connection with the new mayor and his policies, but I'm in terms of the rent freeze that he wants to impose through the Rent Guidelines Board. Can anyone speak to how the new buildings that are being built through 421A and soon to be through 485X, obviously they have stabilized units set by the board. Did anyone speak to, I mean, I feel like most of the attention has been paid to the older distressed buildings that might be really hard hit by the freeze, but what will the effect be like on these mixed income buildings, assuming that if that does go through for multiple years?
It's an interesting question. And I do think that one of the challenges with reviewing the universe of units associated with the rent freeze is just what category of building those units are located in. Are they located in a building that otherwise has units that are not restricted, or are they located in buildings where all the units are restricted? I think that conversation changes based on what the needs of that building are.
It certainly makes the math that much harder on 485X, right? When you're looking at very narrow margins to start because of the lower affordability levels, and you're looking at the higher construction wage costs, and you're looking at, a macro environment where it costs more to get money lended to you. This could potentially a freeze on people wanting to move forward. It's not just a rent freeze. It's can I pay back my loan, or am I looking at zero growth for several years in the time period in which I'm most likely having to pay back my construction loan, waiting on my tax refund? Does that cover it, right? Like for the construction period, the 3-year period, like all of those things now need to be considered.
I think it's a different political conversation between those two scenarios.
Yeah.
Well, on the topic of stuff in the news, I think one of you brought up the governor's environmental review secret proposal in her executive or in state of the state, I guess. Anyone have any thoughts on that? I mean, I don't know if
I'm excited, but I like those things, those details. This has been a national conversation about permitting, about environmental review. What is the right calibration between protecting the environment, between protecting public review or local review? What is the appropriate balance of power, so to speak, between the local municipality and the state government? The states that are doing really well from a housing production standpoint have state mandates delivered to the local municipalities to build more. This was a lot of the conversation under 12 with lifting the 12 FAR cap, right? Like New York City was the only city in the country where the state was telling you don't build more. So now we can build more. What is New York City going to do with that? How are those tools going to be utilized? But there's not a requirement that we build more. We want to build more, which is fantastic. But there's not a requirement. And, there's a lot written about this is not necessarily a city only problem. It's a regional problem and a regional burden.
Actually, beyond, if I could, it's even beyond that. I sit on a national committee of zoning lawyers, real exciting group. And so I hear what's going on throughout the country, and there is this shift. While wanting to protect the environment and being conscious of water and everything related to climate, there is this push, though, that housing is not a New York City only issue. So how do we speed up the process? How do we make it more financeable, but how do we get there sooner? And I mean, California, is long history of permitting nightmares, 5, 10, 15 years. And they've just, with one quick bill, have just reduced the permitting there for a lot of their projects. So there is a national shift on that.
Right. And I think what gets interesting from putting that national lens is also what's the backdrop of the federal government. A lot of times when we're talking about the, reductions and permitting and reducing environmental review, this was all in the Obama Fair Housing Toolkit. This is not under the purview of one particular party or another. This was all in that toolkit. But when you start talking about reducing environmental review, all of a sudden it becomes a virtue signaling. And which party are you affiliated with, and who's asking for this? And this gets back to, I think some of the tensions around 2/3 of New York City residents rent. Rest of the country, that ratio is flipped. But you also have renters behaving like homeowners when it comes to protecting what happens in a particular neighborhood. And what does it mean, again, for things to be affordable, and who are they for, and what's the neighborhood context?
Have any of you seen it? I think when the governor put out her secret proposal last week, it was sort of TBD what the rules in New York City would be. I think maybe that was revealed yesterday as part of her budget, but I didn't see that. Has anyone seen?
Yeah. So if you want to, if you like this stuff, which I do, and since you're all here for a continuing learning credit, I'm assuming you all do too. So the Article 7 language is available on the governor's website. You can start digging through all of this. So I think what was done pretty elegantly is the SEQRA rules, right? The enabling legislation is saying, here's what's going to happen in low density districts and high density districts in flood zones. And then it says to the local municipality, you define what a low density district is. You define what a high density district is. You define where your flood areas are. And I think that's a good way to balance or calibrate that normal tension we see in these conversations, which is the state is telling the local municipality what to do, and the local municipality says, stop, we want local control, go away.
And then for New York City, I think there was supposed to be some kind of cutoff where a building below a certain size would be exempted from this new fast track.
So the thing to think about with all of this is how do we make it easier for people to build housing? And the way you make it easier for people to build housing is you have tax incentives that are financially viable. You have zoning that allows for a variety of building types. You have ideally a permitting process that doesn't take a decade. It takes closer to like a year or two if you look at other municipalities. And in fairness to DOB, they do an excellent job, and it's not 10 years. It's the cumulative of all the various processes that add up to that 10-year metric I usually discuss. But what they are saying is the cutoffs are the unit counts, right? So it's 250 and 500, and that's tied to, again, that low density and high density district. And it's saying based on a decade's worth of environmental impact statements, a decade's worth of environmental assessment statements, these types of projects and those types of districts don't trigger mitigation. And because they don't trigger mitigation, why are we torturing them by going through a multi-month or in some cases a multi-year environmental review process in order to come to the same outcome, which is they don't need to provide more things from an environmental mitigation perspective. And so those are the cutoffs there. But again, the local municipality is going to have to define what those density, like what's a high density, what's a low density, and where those thresholds work.
Any other questions from anyone? Distinguished panelists? I think we're probably good to wrap up. Thank you guys so much.